Yeah, there was someone else.
Fourth speaker is Samuel.
This is in practice.
You know.
We're done with that now. Oh my god. Okay, ready? Okay. I think you're just that tired. Alright. 15 judges. Are you ready? Alright, opponents? Yeah. Lost it. No problem. Alright. Because sometimes you have to pick the gun up to put the gun down, Lofton and I affirm resolve. UN peacekeepers have the power to engage in offensive operations. Contention 1, protecting civilians. James Arbuckle, the Canadian International Peacekeeping Center, explains, in the Cold War era of traditional peacekeeping, force was no part of missions except in the case of a direct threat to the life of a peacekeeper. Unfortunately, this approach significantly harms peacekeeping efforts to protect civilians. Brett Schaefer of the Heritage Foundation explains, uncertainty over rules of engagement and peacekeeping operations to protect civilians contributed to tragic decisions to stand down in the face of atrocities such as in Rwanda in 1994 and Srebrenica in 1995, where over 800,000 civilians were slaughtered. In light of consistent failure to protect civilians, UN mandates expanded peacekeeping operations to include offensive force to protect civilians, leading to drastic improvements. Rose Brooks of Georgetown University finds their civilian protective mandates for UN peacekeeping forces has helped protect civilians in the Côte d'Ivoire, Yemen, Libya, and Mali with impressive success. Holistically, Coffee Prepper of Ohio Northern University finds robust peacekeeping decreases civilian killings by about 31% per year compared to traditional peacekeeping. Not only have offensive operations better protected civilians, but peacekeepers' power deters attacks. Samantha Powers, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, stated, warlords and militants take notice of peacekeepers' willingness to stand up or to stand by. The failure to protect civilians in one mission can undermine the legitimacy of all others. Contention 2, Ukraine. In Ukraine, ethnic separatists backed by Russia are locked in a violent struggle with the government. The only way to bring peace is to deploy peacekeepers with offensive capabilities. As Professor Daniel Dressner of Tufts University wrote in 2014, UN peacekeepers would end the violence in eastern Ukraine and provide humanitarian corridors for residents to escape the violence. Better yet, it would prevent a full-fledged Russian attack. Dressner explains that Russia's ability to use military force to wage war and sponsor separatist violence would be severely restricted. To effectively prevent further bloodshed, peacekeepers would need offensive powers for two reasons. First, they would need to attack militant forces who engage in human rights violations, and second, they would need to use drones to conduct offensive surveillance. A recent UN report found that so long as weapons and soldiers continue to cross into Ukraine, the violence will continue. Fortunately, The Guardian reports that with enough drones, the forces will be able to stop the infiltration of men and material from Russia, ending the conflict. The impact of peace in Ukraine is dramatic. The UN reports in the past 10 months there have been almost 5,000 people killed, 10,000 wounded, and over 1 million people displaced. Worse yet, continued conflict could escalate to Russia, to a Russian invasion, and a NATO-Russia nuclear war. Forbes magazine observed that war-fighting doctrine and capabilities exist on both sides and could lead to nuclear use in a confrontation over Ukraine. Contention 3, domestic spending. War-torn nations have been locked in a cycle of poverty and conflict, having to devote resources to combat security threats instead of to further development projects. Colin Hendricks of the University of Denver finds conflict means increased military spending, crowding out other social expenditures. Offensive operations end this cycle by alleviating the military burden from the host nation. Heen-Ma Yo of the University of Aberdeen finds the intervention of peacekeeping efforts decrease defense expenditures. This is beneficial according to Robert Stein of Rice University because decreased military expenditures free money for other domestic needs such as health and education. The result is breaking the cycle of poverty and war. Schengen Fan of the International Food Policy Research Institute empirically finds that reductions on defense to increase spending on health and education leads to significant economic growth, reducing poverty and fighting the root causes of violence. Put simply, offensive operations by peacekeepers help war-torn nations get on their feet and stay there for the long haul. Vote for peace, vote for the people, vote pro.
We'll be taking some brief comment, please. Someone here got
No. Are all 15 judges ready?
Sure.
Sam and I negate resolve UN peacekeepers have the power to engage in offensive operations. Contention 1, offense creates a hostile environment for peace. In order to engage in offensive operations, the UN inherently has to go in on the side of one group. James Stone of the University of Glasgow explains that UN offense would necessarily have to be on behalf of the government, because if not, it would lose the government's goodwill and its continued operation in the state would be extremely difficult. As a result, Citizen Rockman explains in the Washington Post, the UN could be seen as propping up a corrupt government and aiding an undisciplined military that has a history of human rights abuses. There are two impacts. First, Ragavan explains, this could affect the UN's ability to negotiate peace deals with the militias and risks deepening conflicts because the rebels have no faith that the UN will act as a neutral arbiter. Second, it undermines the operation of civilian protection, peacekeepers, and peace building. Stone furthers, offensive force will undoubtedly lead to the routine targeting of UN forces, even where the particular peacekeeping mission at the particular time is not engaging in enforcement functions. Adam Roberts of Oxford explains how offensive force jeopardizes the consent of the parties to the continued presence of standard peacekeeping. As a result, using offense in the short term precludes prospects for peace in the long term, because according to Columbia's Paige Fortna, the presence of traditional peacekeeping reduces the recidivism of conflict by 99%. Contention 2 is offense intensifies conflict. Major Robert Allen writes, the UN system is inherently dysfunctional in regards to mobilizing and controlling the complex military operations required in offensive environments. Absent intervention by an outside non-UN power, they have proven militarily unworkable. This is true due to 4 systemic flaws with offense. First, a lack of funds and equipment. Sloan explains, constant pressures on resources are likely to lead to peacekeeping missions with personnel and resources which are insufficient to accomplish their more forceful mandates. Second, a lack of troops. Sloan explains, the imposition of a forceful mandate may actually lead to states being less willing to contribute troops for fear of increased casualties. Third, a lack of intelligence. Hugh Smith of the Australian Defence Studies Centre finds peacekeepers lack access to sufficient info before they are deployed, making an effective attack near impossible. Fourth, a lack of a unified command structure and communication. Allen explains how the divergent forces with different customs and chains of command makes the coordination essential to fulfill their offensive missions near impossible. As a result, NYU Simon Chesterman finds, every single instance which the UN has used military force has ended in utter failure. Indeed, the probability that offensive forces increase violence are greater than the probability that they decrease it for 3 reasons. First, Pietro Van Holder of the Peace and Life Institute finds that offensive forces may be seen as a kind of occupation force. As a consequence, it could become a push factor for some to join armed groups. This could be exacerbated because, according to a Reuters article from yesterday, the newly announced offensive against the FDLR in the Congo could lead to the displacement and antagonism of tens of thousands of civilians, matching the million displaced in the prior offensive and fueling thousands of recruits for rebel groups. Second, Reed Wood of Arizona State explains that directly confronting attackers doesn't eliminate violence. It just changes its nature from soldier-on-soldier violence to soldier-on-civilian violence, as the rebel force feels that they can no longer succeed confronting the UN head-on. Third, by extending the conflict. Sankey Kim of the University of Iowa explains, government-biased interveners tend to encourage both groups to continue fighting and weaken their motives to cooperate with each other to make an agreement, because the backside believe that they can get more benefit by waiting for the ultimate defeat of their enemy. The African Policy Group confirms this, noting that the Congolese army and government walked away from promising negotiations in the Congo once offensive force was announced, believing that they could achieve better terms through the barrel of the gun. University of Utah's Jordan Roberts confirms this, writing that the presence of offensive force increases the probability of civil war reoccurrence for a given year by 680%, while the presence of defensive support decreases the probability of civil war reoccurrence for a given year by 93%. The confluence of these 3 forces empirically increases violence. According to an analysis of UN operations by Coffee Nasia Pepra of Ohio Northern University, quote, when the mandate permits UN forces to use force beyond that of self-defense, the count of intentional civilian killings increases by roughly 1,700 per conflict per year. Break the cycle of violence. Vote negative.
Is everyone ready? So at the very bottom of your case, you talk about you cite the Pepper analysis, right? So you say that intentional attacks on civilians go up. So what does Pepper actually conclude?
Pepper concludes that offense is a bad idea for peacekeepers. In fact, you discussed robust peacekeeping yesterday, Pepper. Does Pepper define robustly as distinct from that in which the mandate permits UN forces to use force beyond that of self-defense?
Robust peacekeeping is using whatever force necessary to defend the mandate, including offensive
You
force.
misunderstand. There are limitations on robust peacekeeping.
What are those?
Robust peacekeeping says you are allowed to use force to protect civilians, but you are not allowed to go on the offensive and actually defeat them. Here's the reason. According to the definition of offense by the U.S. military, the definition of offense is to actually fire the first shot to defeat and destroy the opposing group. What robust peacekeeping does is use force to protect civilians, but it doesn't seek to actually go out and defeat the group. Robust peacekeeping does not meet the definition of offense. But can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Who's on the Security Council?
A bunch of different countries.
The Big Five. The Big Five get the veto power over everyone else.
Sure. Okay.
What?
Oh, like Russia, China, US.
Russia's on it. They get a veto power over any UN action, right?
Actually, that's not true. In this specific example of the UN, because Russia had actually intervened in the Crimea and actually lost the right to veto because it has an interest in
Lost the right. No, that is not how the UN Security Council works. You do not cede the right to veto if you have an interest. Big powers always have an interest. Russia is on the Security Council if they get a veto. What's the probability that the UN peacekeepers are going to get in with Russia having that veto on the Security Council?
A lot, because both sides of the conflict, both the that's the word, and the Ukrainian government both have already called for peacekeeping operations.
Okay. But they haven't come through, right? How long has the Ukrainian conflict been around?
Like a year and a half.
And how long has the peacekeepers been there?
Well, we're saying that we need peacekeepers right now. So
what's the probability that they're ever going to get in at the point where they've been calling for this and they haven't arrived because Russia, who doesn't want the peacekeepers there, has a veto on the Security Council?
Okay, why does probability matter? We're only talking about whether they should or not.
Right. Whether the United Nations have the power to engage in offensive operations. If the one example that you're giving me of where it's successful, if you vote pro, they don't go into the Ukraine. You just generally give them the power. They're not going to Ukraine. They're probably going to be doing things like Somalia, Congo, those examples.
Here's the problem, though. We're not talking about whether they're going to or not. We're talking about whether they should go in or not. We show you that they should because they could.
Voting pro gives the United Nations peacekeepers the power to engage in offensive operations. It does not give the affirmative the ability to fiat every single conflict that they want to go into and decide, pick and choose at conflicts around the world. You don't get to say, I want Tibet, I want Ukraine. You don't get to choose that. The United Nations does. All voting pro does is give the choice to the United Nations to use offensive force. It does not allow them to pick and choose which conflicts to go in.
I would say it does because it's only talking about should. Like, even if the UN doesn't want to go in, they should go in.
That means voting pro, giving them the power to go in, does not mean the peacekeepers going to.
We're not giving them. Voting pro isn't giving them the power. It's saying that they should give them the power.
So before getting into the specifics of my opponent's case, we need to realize what the affirmative advocacy is. We're saying that in a certain instance, UN peacekeepers should have the ability to use offensive operations. If you negate, you're saying that they can never do that. So if you think that there's just one instance in which we need offensive operations, you should affirm. Now with that in mind, let's look to my opponent's case. In their first contention, they say that we shouldn't use offensive force because when we take a side, that harms our path to peace. There are a couple problems with this. First, it's non-unique. This happens with defensive peacekeeping operations as well. Take, for example, our current operations in Mali. UN peacekeepers there aren't using offensive operations, they're using defensive operations, but they're clearly on the side of the Malayan government and against the rebels in the region. They are taking a side and they're using defensive operations. Second, we actually need offensive operations to uphold impartiality and uphold legal norms. According to Hikara Yamashita of the National Institute for Defense Studies, impartiality has come to mean a robust mandate implementation. The reason for this is that we actually have to use offensive force to people who are committing human rights abuses. If we sit by and let human rights abusers get away with what they're doing, that shows that we aren't being impartial and that actually harms peace efforts. Looking at my opponent's specific points, they talk about civilian protection and how there's going to be this backlash against civilians. The problem with this is that doing nothing is going to incite even more backlash. The Wall Street Journal reported in 2012 that civilians are tired of sitting by while UN peacekeepers do nothing. In the Congo, this resulted in civilians attacking UN peacekeeping bases. Indeed, in one attack, they attacked a UN base and killed 11 peacekeepers. If we sit by and do nothing, that's not the solution. In my opponent's second contention, they talk about these harms that are going to make offensive peacekeeping fail. First, they talk about a lack of funds. However, they fundamentally misunderstand how funding UN peacekeeping operations work. They're funded on a mission-by-mission basis on how much people want to donate. With offensive operations, there's more support to donate more money. Specifically, according to Donald Stowe of the Strategic Studies Institute, there's more support for offensive missions from the big funders, specifically the United States and European powers. Then they talk about a lack of troops. Fortunately, China's solving this problem. In recent years, China's tripled the amount of peacekeeping troops that they're putting in, and they can solve for any gaps. Third, my opponents talk about a lack of info. We can use this like we talked about in our second contention with intelligence gathering drones that can get the necessary information for offensive operations. Then they talk about a lack of command. However, the United States actually contributes military generals to these peacekeeping operations, so they have good leadership and good command. Then looking at my opponent's impacts, they first talk about how the UN is seen as an intervention force, or an occupation force, and that's no good. First, remember that the people want the UN to use offensive operations. They've been striking the UN when the UN hasn't used offensive operations. They talk about how tens of thousands of people are going to be displaced with fighting the FDLR, but look at what was happening before the UN actually intervened with offensive force in the Congo. Specifically, according to Alexia Jablonski, writing in the McGill International Review, over 1 million people were displaced in the Congo conflict before the UN intervened with offensive operations. Then my opponents go on to talking about how we're changing the conflict, and instead of militants fighting militants, they're now fighting civilians and these UN non-offensive operations. The problem with this is that this empirically hasn't happened. Specifically, according to Abby Stoddard of NYU, there's no strong evidence of a correlation of increased attacks on aid workers or UN peacekeepers in areas where the UN plays a more aggressive role in the conflict. Even if we have offensive operations, this hasn't happened in the status quo. The reason for this is that increased mission success means that these rebel groups are being taken out. Take, for example, in the Congo, we've seen a decrease in violence. Now, quickly returning to the affirmative case, specifically about the Ukraine point. My opponents bring up in Crossfire that Russia's going to veto any proposal to do this. There are 3 problems with this. First, it's politically unfeasible. Russia said they don't have any interest in the Ukraine region, and they deny any troops in the region, so it would be politically infeasible for them to veto it. Second, it saves face for Putin. Currently, the rebels are losing in the Ukraine. However, Putin doesn't want to be seen as weak and doesn't want to lose. At that point, it gives him a cop-out for his propaganda machine. Third, what Eileen brings up about how the UN or Russia can't actually veto this. So for all of these reasons, we urge an affirmative ballot.
Judges. Before I get into the specifics of their case, there's 2 overall problems with their reasoning. The first is, if you believe them to be true, then we should have expected offensive force in the past to be successful. Yet according to Simon Chesterton of NYU, who's in case and they never respond to, every single time we've used offensive force in the past, it has failed. The significance of this is that even if you buy their theory, the fact that in reality is a failure is going to be enough for you to negate. The second overall problem is that they're making the wrong comparative in their case. They're comparing traditional peacekeeping with offensive peacekeeping, but that's not the comparison that's going to happen in the real world. Post-2003, the Brahimi Report authorized the United Nations to use things called robust peacekeeping, which means using any force necessary to protect civilians, which is an offensive force. In fact, Coffee and Cia Pepper, their own author, tells us that that reduces civilian killings by 31%, compared to offensive force, which increases civilian killings by 1,600. When you make the right comparison like they're not making, that's where you see the harms of offensive force. Now to the first contention, which talks about protecting civilians. There's a lot of problems with this. But first, right off the bat, turn the argument against them, because you're actually going to be harming civilians. The reason is that when you give extra force to like a government force, like what would happen if you had offensive force, the rebels don't just go away. What happens is they think that they can no longer confront the government head on, so in order to get leverage, they turn to asymmetric warfare, transforming the world of war from soldier-on-soldier violence into soldier-on-civilian violence. That's the warrant for Pepper, who finds a 1,700 increase in the total amount of civilian deaths. But second, keep in mind that even if they prove a de-escalation of the conflict and the de-intensification, that doesn't matter. To the point where Sankey Kim of the University of Iowa explains that what happens when you give extra force to the government, they feel they have no incentive to stop fighting because they're backed by the UN, which empirically lengthens the duration of the conflict. That means even if they prove that the intensity goes down, since the duration increases, more civilians are going to die, it's still going to be bad on net. Then they give you a couple pieces of evidence from Brooks and Pepper saying that it reduces violence. This is actually going to be really, really good for our side. The reason is that Brooks is talking about civilian protection measures and Pepper is talking about robust peacekeeping. Neither of those are offensive forces. Both of those are not offensive forces. No actual reason to vote for us. To the point where we can solve the problem with not using offensive force, not compromising the legitimacy of the United Nations, is going to be a crucial reason why you're going to negate today's round. Then they tell you it's going to be deterring people. The problem is that's not true in the real world, to the point where we look in the Congo where deterrence isn't working at all, and the rebel group is still out there. It's not confirmed. The last point is that they're giving you no reason why the UN has to take these options. When we look in the real world, there's other regional actors who, according to Murat Golding, of the former Undersecretary General of the United Nations, actually have 3 times the success rate of the United Nations. Even if you buy what they're saying, since they're crowding on a more effective organization, it's actually a reason to vote for us. Now to the next intention, which talks about like using peacekeepers in Ukraine. There's a lot of problems with this. The first one is something that Will alluded to in Crossfire. Namely, Russia is on the Security Council. They will never let the peacekeepers go into the Ukraine. Their card tells us that like they will lose the veto power. That's only if the Russian invasion is confirmed. To the point where they're not actually invading, they're just backing the rebels. And to the point where they've been doing this for the last 2 years and it still hasn't been confirmed. It's never going to get confirmed in the future. They are never going to intervene there. But next, look at the fact that even if they did intervene, they would never stop them. To the point where if they're going to try to confront Russia, the 9th most populous nation in the world, the 3rd largest military in the world, they'll never succeed. There's 0 probability of success. Then they tell you you're going to be using drones. That's not offensive force, that's surveillance. But fourth, they talk about next they talk about nuclear war. Here's where you turn against them. Because if you start attacking the United Nations attacks Russia, they're probably going to be withdrawing from the United Nations. At that point, you lose a very crucial check on like de-escalating conflicts between between Russia and other nations. If you lose that check on stopping nuclear war, you actually increase the probability of nuclear war if you vote for them. Now to the next intention, which talks about domestic spending. 2 problems. First, they give you exactly 0 real-world analysis. They give you no real-world example. We literally have no way to weigh this argument. But second, this actually takes out all their offense. The reason is that if increasing UN spending leads to decreased domestic military spending, that means the total military spending remains constant. It means you're not actually seeing any increase in force in the region. You're not actually going to be stopping the conflict at all. Their own evidence is a reason to vote negative.
So you talk about how if there's a decrease in spending domestically and there's an increase in UN spending, that it cancels out. Why does that make sense?
Because that's what you're, I don't think it does.
It's not like a one-to-one relationship. That's not what we're saying.
Then what are you? So you're telling us, what are you saying?
So what we're saying is that right now these war-torn nations are locked in a cycle of conflict. To maintain security, these governments are having to spend a ton of money on security. When the UN intervenes and provides that security, the governments don't have to spend on security and spend on health and education.
Like right where they're doing offensive force now. 2 questions on that.
Yep.
One, how much has domestic spending on security reduced in the Congo? And my second question is, what is the probability that the incredibly corrupt Joseph Kabila regime in the Congo is going to be using those extra money for anything good rather than its own profit?
Okay, so first, the intervention in the conflict in the Congo hasn't actually finished yet, so we can't really tell. But second, when we look holistically, instead of one isolated example, we see that it inherently
let's look holistically.
Yeah.
So that clearly means there's been more than one UN offensive intervention, right?
Right, that's what we showed you in our first convention.
Where else have they intervened?
In Cote d'Ivoire, Yemen, Libya, and Mali.
Really? They used offensive force in Cote d'Ivoire.
Yeah.
What exactly actually did they do?
So what they were doing is that they went in and they went beyond the traditional definition of self-defense and what you bring up
That's
about
actually
the
not what happened in Cote d'Ivoire.
To protect civilians.
What actually happened in Cote d'Ivoire, right? You had the previous president, Laurent Gbagbo, sorry, I forgot his first name. Then you have the person who was next elected in a sketchy election, but technically democratic elected, which is Laurent Ouattara. They had a civil war between them because Gbagbo refused to concede the election. They were just protecting the civilians in the civil war. They weren't going on an offensive against any of the forces.
Okay, no, they actually were doing more than what they've been doing before. They were using a more offensive stance, and that was working.
The design was to protect civilians. It's still robust peacekeeping.
Well, no, because they were using more offensive mandate. Like, what ended up happening in the end? They had to take, like, one side had to
The violence still is going on, right? The Ouattara-Gbagbo conflict still rages in Cote d'Ivoire.
Brooks actually finds that there's been impressive success in all 4 of these examples.
And it's
there's
not
been a decrease in violence.
Wait, offensive?
So
the problem is...
You're looking, like, too far in the past.
No. The problem is that, like, in order to be offensive, your idea has to be, like, to wipe out the other group. We're not trying to wipe out the group.
That's a very extreme definition of offensive. Nope. All offensive means is taking a preemptive stance to attack these people.
Not if the purpose is to protect civilian. That's distinct. That's distinct. That's robust peacekeeping.
That only counts if there's an extremely imminent threat to the civilians. If you're taking a more
preemptive approach,
that's what they're doing in Cote
d'Ivoire. Your own author, Pepper, who's the empirics on that, contrasts robust peacekeeping with force used beyond self-defense. They specifically contrast this. Our definition is coming from your author. No, contrasting is the opposite.
Right, but that's not what he actually does.
No. His table on page 211 of his book specifically has at the top robust peacekeeping, and then right below it, forced use beyond defense of the mandate.
Okay. All right. Warren's prep time.
All right, everyone ready? Okay. Let's stop them. The first way you can vote pro is the analysis that Lofton gives you at the top of his rebuttal. He tells you that because the resolution is asking us whether or not they should have the power, that means in the neg world they will never have the power to engage in offensive operations. Thus, if we prove that one example of offensive operations will work and should work, then or should be implemented, then we can win this round. And in today's context, that's Ukraine. Look to our second contention about Ukrainian conflict and how peacekeepers can solve. According to The Guardian, if we use drones, intelligence drones, and buttress the offensive operations with peacekeepers with this intelligence, we can reduce the amount of arms going over the border, which will stop the conflict. My opponents respond to this by saying that we'll never succeed attacking Russia. They don't really understand what's happening in this contention, though. We're saying we're intervening between the separatists and the Ukrainian government. The separatists are not actually, well, Russia denies backing the separatists, and that's another reason why Russia won't actually veto. They have no political reason to veto because they say they're not backing the separatists. Actually vetoing would just admit to backing internationally condemned behavior. So they won't actually veto because it'll just reflect poorly on them. Now the second reason you can affirm in today's round is because we're actually shifting development spending to the host nations. In the status quo, these countries are ridden in a conflict and poverty cycle, I guess. By sending peacekeepers in, this means that the host nations will have to spend as much on military spending, and instead, empirically according to Stein, they spend more on health and education, solving the root of the conflict, which is poverty, and their humanitarian problems. Now, my opponent is trying to tell you that offensive operations trade off with domestic spending and that somehow cancels out, but we're actually replacing the domestic military spending with more effective operational spending with the UN, which is the third way you can vote pro, that is effective at stopping conflict. My opponents essentially say in every single situation with offensive force, it hasn't worked. Look to specifically the Democratic Republic of the Congo. When offensive force was used there, it stopped the conflict, the M23 rebels were taken out, and in fact it shortened the duration of the conflict substantially. My opponents then say robust peacekeeping isn't actually offensive, but that's just using whatever force needed to protect the mandate. That includes offensive force. And when we see that robust peacekeeping decreases civilian deaths by 31%, you can feel comfortable affirming.
Okay, is everybody ready? Overview, 2 reasons to vote for the negative. On the overview, she says that all you need to prove is that one example where you need to use offensive force. The problem isn't the resolutionality. When you affirm, you give all peacekeeping operations the option to use offensive force. That means the UN is likely to use them in more scenarios than just one. Even if they prove that it works in one scenario, that makes the other scenarios in the general case worse, that's sufficient for you to vote negative. Okay, the first reason you vote negative is the idea how offense is going to be escalating conflict. This operates as a prerequisite to their case in 3 ways. First, if we win escalation, it means that the civilians are better off. That's a prerequisite to the first connection. Second, it means that it's likely that the Ukraine operation will fail as well. And third, it means that military spending is going to increase because the conflict is escalating. Here's how we prove this. We're telling you with the Allen analysis, the UN is a uniquely dysfunctional organization, unlike the secede. This provides the reasoning for the Chesterman analysis, because every historical example we've used offensive force in the past has failed. They like to talk about the Côte d'Ivoire. The offensive force was not used in the Côte d'Ivoire. They like to talk about the Congo. The problem with the Congo is created a power vacuum that's actually escalated the cycle of violence. No example in the real world has offensive force ever succeeded. So why is this how happened? Why is offensive force failed? First comes from Van Holder. It says the UN is seen as an occupation force. That's why they're seeing this, because Reuters tells you in the last offensive they've done, 1 million people were displaced. That's fueling thousands of recruits for the rebels. The second comes from Kim, with a cold drop in the rebuttal. It says the government has no incentive to negotiate when you use offensive force. The example comes from the African Policy Institute in the Congo. The Congolese government walked away from promising negotiations once the offense was announced, believing they could get better benefits if they continued to attack. 2 empirics will make it very clear to vote for the negative. One is the Roberts analysis that they cold drop. Says when you use offensive force, the amount of increased violence by 680%. When you use defense, it decreases it by -3%. Second is from Pepra, who says when you use robust peacekeeping that's not offensive, it reduces civilian killings by 31%, but when you use offensive force, it increases civilian killings by 1,700. Very clear place to vote negative. Then go into their advocacy. They like to talk a lot about Russia. Couple problems. One, Russia is likely to veto the action. Second, just because Russia says they have no interest in Ukraine, they definitely have an interest in Ukraine. They're likely to block it. Then on domestic spending, recognize One, if you escalate the conflict, more domestic spending goes up. And second, the governments are too corrupt. Even if they reduce military spending, it's not going to develop. It's just going to the pockets of Joseph Kabila and his oligarchical elite. Thank you.
All right. Okay, you guys good?
Yep.
Okay. So you say that Russia does have an interest in the conflict, even though they say they don't.
Yeah,
So
you
the
can
point,
really can't
how can
trust
Russia
them.
actually effectively veto this proposition without with maintaining that political guise that they're carrying
No
out?
one in the international community seriously believes that they have no interest in Ukraine.
Right,
By
but
vetoing
Putin-
it, they're not shattering any illusions that make people mad.
But Putin, in the country of Russia, has pretty much based all of his political standing on the fact that they're the ones being attacked, and Russia is doing something good, and they aren't actually intervening in Ukraine.
Two things left. The first one is, as you yourself probably know, Putin does not acknowledge that the Ukrainian government right there, right in there right now, is legitimate. So he's by vetoing it, he wouldn't be defending his actions in Ukraine. He'd just be voicing voicing disapproval of the government in Ukraine right now. But the second problem is that even if Russia didn't do it, they have a lot of allies. For instance, China. So even if Russia didn't do it, China could still veto it. And so even if Russia tries to maintain face, we're still not going to see action.
Why would China do that?
Because China probably doesn't want them interfering with a big superpower conflict.
Okay, but
If
China's
the
actually
UN starts doing
benefiting.
something that Russia believes is contrary to their interests, Russia is probably going to be quitting the United Nations or trying to block their efforts. You need Russian cooperation. Trying to use the UN to attack Russian interests and put them on Russia's border is probably going to make the conflict much worse.
Okay, here's the thing though. You're still ignoring what the resolution is asking us to debate. We're talking about, in the affirmative world, they should do something. Whether it's going to happen or whether it will happen doesn't matter in today's round.
Eileen, I think you're wrong in that scenario. You do not, the affirmative get to pick and choose a single random conflict somewhere in the world. You don't get to say, in Tibet we should use it. You don't get to say, in Kashmir you could use it. When you vote pro, you give the United Nations the authority to use offensive force.
Right, but
that means you have to look to what the UN would likely do with that authority to use offensive force.
Okay.
They're not going to the Ukraine. They're probably going to continue going into the Congo,
here's the problem.
maybe into Somalia.
Here's
That's
the-
what happens.
Okay, here's the problem. When you vote con, you say that the UN can never ever use offensive operations for peacekeepers.
But they
And
would-
at that point, it eliminates any chance.
It's a moot point because there's a zero probability in the status quo.
It's not
that they'll
true.
go into the
There are a
Ukraine.
lot of calls for peacekeepers to go in.
Yeah,
the rebels
all
want
of
peacekeepers. The
Keep going
Ukrainian
into,
government wants
half the
peacekeepers.
countries on the planet. Just because there are calls doesn't mean it's likely to, especially when you
What do you
consider
mean?
the internal
At the
security
point when both
politics.
parties of the conflict are calling for peacekeepers, isn't it likely that they'll intervene?
No.
No.
Why?
Because the UN would never send troops into something down the Russian border, and that could potentially antagonize Putin and the third largest military in the world. There's a reason why UN peacekeepers have never gotten involved in major superpower conflicts.
I mean,
It's because
they
that would
did
destroy the nation, the unity that the UN needs to put on.
Okay, I guess it's your turn to ask a question if you want.
Yeah, sure. So, what actually exactly did they do in Cote d'Ivoire?
We've gone over this, but you're missing the point. There are a lot of examples of offensive force. Stop focusing on the one isolated instance.
Okay, we're going to argue with the chest and evidence. All those lots of examples, all of them have failed.
Alright, let's go. Remember that when you negate in today's round, you say that UN peacekeepers can never use offensive capabilities. That's really dangerous because there are examples like we bring up with Ukraine of where offensive capabilities are needed and peacekeepers should intervene. Remember, that's what we're debating in today's round, what should happen, not what feasibly will happen. So now with that in mind, let's look to the Ukrainian conflict. Remember, the reason according to the UN why the conflict is happening right now is because Russia continues to funnel weapons and troops over the border. However, fortunately, this can be solved with offensive operations by peacekeepers on the ground, supported by UAVs that gather intelligence and give that to the peacekeepers to engage in offensive operations to stop human rights abusers. Now, my opponent's main response to this is that Russia's going to stop it from happening. Remember, they ignore the second reason why I show you that won't happen. And don't let them respond to that in final focus. It's too late. This can save face for Putin. Remember, the rebels are currently losing. Putin needs a cop-out because he's based his political career on the fact that he can have success in the Ukraine. This gives him a cop-out because he doesn't want to attack the UN. So he can say, sure, UN, go in there with your offensive operations, we'll pull out, it'll create peace in Ukraine. The reason that this outweighs my opponent's arguments is because this conflict is really large. It's already killed 10,000 people, it's displacing many more, and it has the chance to escalate into a nuclear conflict. At that point, you should feel very comfortable voting pro. But the next reason why you should vote pro is because of domestic spending. Remember, these war-torn countries, like the ones in Africa, like the Congo, are stuck in a cycle of spending where they have to devote almost all their resources to defense. Fortunately, when UN peacekeepers come into the area and use offensive operations, the local government doesn't have to use as much military force, and empirically that's resulted in a shift to spending in the health and education sector. The result of that is that we stop the root cause of conflict. Even if you believe what my opponents are telling you about conflict increasing in the short term, in the long term we stop the root cause of conflict. Now, looking at my opponent's arguments, remember the big problem. Their evidence about offensive operations, like that 680% stuff, isn't looking directly at UN operations. When we look at UN robust peacekeeping operations that include offensive operations, the number of civilian deaths decreased by 31%. That's empirically what happens, and we give you the reasons why in our first contention. Therefore, we urge an affirmative ballot.
We'll be taking a remaining minute.
When evaluating today's ground, we have to examine what would likely happen if we were to affirm and negate the resolution. And what's likely to happen is you're not going to be invading Ukraine. You're not going to be that's going to happen. If you affirm the resolution, it's not at all going to happen. You have to look at the likely consequences are. And the first likely consequence is that the conflict is actually going to escalate. It's going to ultimately be counterproductive. Remember the Chesterman analysis. It tells you that every single time we've used offensive force in the past, it has failed. Their theory is simply contradicted by reality. Their only examples of success that they give you, all of which are examples of robust peacekeeping. But as their own author, Coffee to Sia Pepper, tells you, contrast robust peacekeeping with offensive peacekeeping. Their own evidence is actually going to be evidence for us. In fact, let's examine why the conflict's actually going to get worse. The first, it comes from Van Holten, who they drop, who tells you that because the UN is seen as an occupying force, it increases rebel recruitment. That's going to be particularly bad for Ukraine, like they like to talk about, given how there's a rebel insurgency. The second analysis comes from Kim. She explains that the government has no incentive to stop fighting if they feel like the UN's always going to come on their side, and lengthening the duration of the conflict. Even if they reduce the intensity of the conflict in a place like Ukraine, since the duration is going to get longer, more civilians are going to die. But here's the really important analysis. This is from Roberts, who says that because for the same reason, there's a 680% more likely the conflict will break out again,